This podcast is part of the National Archives War on Film series, marking the 70th anniversary of the start of the Second World War. Download more podcasts at nationalarchives.gov.uk.
The Longest Day recounts probably one of the most significant events in the Second World War, the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944. Landings in Normandy took two parts. Operation Neptune, which was the naval aspect of the operation, which was getting the forces to France, and Operation Overlord, which was the actual landings. By putting Allied forces in northern France, the Allies started to relieve the pressure on the Eastern Front in Russia and enabled the Allied forces to move further into France and force the occupying Germans back through France and Belgium and Holland back into Germany. Following dispatch from Field Marshal Lord Montgomery, commanding officer of the 21st Army Group, describes the planning and execution of the D-Day landings.
The intention was to assault simultaneously beaches on the Normandy coast with the object of securing, as a base for further operations, a lodgement area which was to include airfield sites and the port of Cherbourg. Once ashore and firmly established, my plan was to threaten to break out on the eastern flank. By this threat, to draw the main enemy reserves into that sector, to fight them there and keep them there, using the British and Canadian armies for the purpose. Having got the main enemy reserves committed on the eastern flank, my plan was to make the breakout on the western flank, using for this task the American armies. This attack was to be delivered southwards, down to the Loire, and then to proceed eastwards in a wide sweep up to the Seine about Paris. This would cut off all the enemy forces south of the Seine, over which river the bridges were to be destroyed by air action. The operations developed in June, July and August exactly as planned. I had given D+90 as a target date for being lined up on the Seine. Actually, the first crossing of the river was made on D+75. The Normandy beaches were selected because they offered a better shelter for shipping and were less heavily defended than other possible beach areas along the Channel coast. They satisfied the minimum requirements of the air forces in terms of their distance from home bases for the provision of air cover. The absence of major ports was overcome by the gigantic engineering feat of constructing two artificial ports in the UK. These were towed across the Channel in sections and erected, one in the US sector and one in the British sector. The invasion operations may be said to have begun with the action of the air forces. The first stage was the gaining of air superiority, an essential preliminary always to all major offensive operations. This task was admirably accomplished. As D-Day drew nearer, attacks were delivered against coast defences along the whole length of the Atlantic Wall. Meanwhile, prevention of enemy air reconnaissance during the period of concentration of the invasion forces was highly successful and contributed towards the gaining of tactical surprise. Naval operations were intensified against E-boats and U-boats as the Great Day approached. During the night preceding D-Day, while the naval assault forces made the sea passage, the programme of intensive air action against the enemy defences was to begin with operations by Bomber Command, while airborne forces were to be dropped on the flanks of the invasion area. At H hour, supported by naval bombardment and air action, and by the guns, rockets and mortars of close support craft, the leading wave of troops was to disembark and force its way ashore. Once the troops were ashore, it was necessary for them to crack about. The need for sustained energy and drive was paramount, as it was necessary to link our beachheads and penetrate quickly inland before the enemy opposition crystallised. I gave orders that the leading formations should bypass major enemy centres of resistance in order to peg out claims inland. I emphasised to commanders on all levels that determined leadership would be necessary to withstand the strain of the first few days, to retain the initiative and to make sure that there would be no setbacks. As a result of our D-Day operations, a foothold had been gained on the continent of Europe. Surprise had been achieved, the troops had fought magnificently, and our losses had been much lower than had ever seemed possible.
The Normandy landings are a significant point in the history of the British Armed Forces and the Second World War. Although information relating to given individuals, i.e. the records of service of many men who took part in the landings, are still retained by the Ministry of Defence, it is possible to visit the National Archives and look at the activities of the British Army regiments, the Royal Navy warships and the RAF squadrons which took part in the landings on D-Day.
This podcast includes images and extracts taken from records at the National Archives and is copyright of the Crown.